The steam rose year-round. Even in the deepest cold of February, when the fjord froze solid and the snow buried the landscape under 4 feet of white, the steam rose from the cleft in the rocks behind Thyra Ketilsdottir's farm, like the breath of something vast and patient sleeping beneath the earth. The hot spring had been there longer than any person in the Eyjafjord district could remember, longer than the settlement, longer than the sagas. It emerged from a crack in the basalt at the base of the hillside, pooled in a natural depression roughly 8 feet across, and overflowed in a shallow stream that ran 40 yards down the slope before cooling enough to freeze in winter. The water temperature at the source was 140 degrees, hot enough to scald, hot enough to cook, hot enough to kill a man who fell in. Nobody used it for anything. That was the thing that puzzled Thyra most when she arrived at the farm. The settlement had known about the spring for generations. Children were warned away from it. Animals were fenced from it. Visitors marveled at it. But nobody had ever found a practical purpose for water that was too hot to touch and too remote from the Longhouses to be convenient. The spring was 200 yards uphill from the nearest dwelling. Carrying hot water downhill in buckets was possible, but pointless. By the time you reached your door, the water was warm. By the time you poured it into a trough, it was tepid. The heat was real, abundant, and perpetual, but it was in the wrong place. Thyra was 29 years old, a widow for the second time, and she was running out of options that did not involve begging. Her first husband, Kjartan, had died of a fever when she was 22. Her second husband, Hallstein, had drowned in a fishing accident 3 years later, leaving her with a 7-year-old son named Arn, 60 acres of marginal grazing land, and a longhouse that was too far from the settlement center to attract help, and too close to the hot spring to attract buyers. Nobody wanted to farm next to the scalding water. The steam smelled of sulfur. The ground near the spring was soft and treacherous. The grass that grew closest to it was coarse and bitter, unsuitable for grazing. The cursed farm, people called it. 2 dead husbands, bad land, hot water nobody could use. The first winter alone was the worst. Thyra had never managed a longhouse by herself. She had never cut her own firewood. She had never repaired a roof or sealed a wall or maintained a hearth through 7 months of cold without a partner to share the labor. Hallstein had done the heavy work. Before him, Kjartan had done it. Before Kjartan, her father had done it. She had always been warm because someone else had made her warm. Now there was no one. Arn was 7. He could carry kindling, but not split logs. He could feed the fire, but not build one. He could not climb to the roof to patch the sod when the wind tore it. He could not haul the heavy timber that was needed to shore up the sagging wall frame. He was a child, and the work of winter was not children's work. By January of that first year, Thyra was burning everything she could find. The woodpile was gone by the 12th. She burned driftwood collected from the fjord shore, carrying it uphill on her back, 1/2 mile each trip. She burned dried sheep dung, which gave heat but filled the longhouse with a thick, acrid smoke that made Arn cough through the night. She burned peat cut from the bog behind the farm, wet peat that hissed and smoldered and gave barely enough heat to keep the water pot from freezing. The longhouse was cold, not just uncomfortable, dangerous. The drafts ran through the failing wall joints like knives, and the fire she could maintain was too small to fight them. She survived that winter through sheer stubbornness and through the help of a neighbor, a farmer named Gudmundur, who brought firewood twice in February, not out of charity, but because he needed Thyra's grazing land for his sheep, and a dead widow meant the land would revert to the Jarl rather than remain available for lease. The help was transactional, the warmth was borrowed, and Thyra understood, lying awake on a freezing night in March while the spring steamed uselessly 200 yards uphill, that borrowed warmth was no warmth at all. That was when she remembered her grandmother. Thyra's grandmother, on her mother's side, was an Irish woman named Brigid, who had been taken in a raid and brought to Iceland as a thrall before earning her freedom through 20 years of labor. Brigid had been dead for 6 years, but the stories she had told Thyra as a child remained. They remained the way a grandmother's stories always remain, not as specific knowledge, but as a feeling, a shape, an impression that comes back whole when the right circumstances trigger it. And lying on a freezing floor while free heat rose from the earth behind her house was the right circumstance. Brigid had told stories about the Roman baths in places she had never seen but had heard about from monks. Great stone buildings where hot water was channeled through the floors and walls, heating entire structures without a single fire. The Romans called it a hippocaust. Brigid called it common sense. If the water is hot and the house is cold, Brigid used to say, you bring the water to the house. You do not bring the house to the water. This is not wisdom. This is plumbing. Thyra had been 9 years old when she heard this. She had not thought about it for 20 years. She had not needed to. She had lived in longhouses that were heated by fire, the way every longhouse was heated, and the fire was adequate, and the cold was endurable, and nobody questioned the arrangement because nobody had an alternative. Now she had an alternative. 200 yards uphill from her door, 140 degrees of free heat emerged from the earth 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, asking nothing and offering everything. All she had to do was get it from there to here. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Whether you're in a place where the heat rises from the earth, or somewhere the winters demand everything you have, these stories of hidden preparation are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the cold arrives and only one floor in the settlement stays warm. The idea was simple. The execution was brutal. She needed a channel. A covered stone channel that would carry hot water from the spring downhill to her longhouse, run it under the floor in a series of loops, and then discharge the cooled water into the stream below. The channel had to be watertight. It had to be insulated enough to retain the water's heat over 200 yards of distance. It had to be graded precisely, steep enough that the water would flow by gravity alone, shallow enough that it would not arrive as a torrent that overwhelmed the floor system. And it had to be built from stone, because stone was the only material available that could withstand constant exposure to hot, mineral-rich water without rotting, corroding, or dissolving. She went to see old Snorri. He was not a builder by trade. He was a stoneworker, a man who had spent his life cutting, shaping, and fitting stone for foundations, walls, hearths, and burial markers. He was 69 years old, half deaf, and his hands were so scarred from decades of chiseling that they looked like maps of a country that had been through many wars. But he understood stone the way some men understand horses, instinctively, physically, through touch and weight and grain. You want to channel the hot spring, he said. It was not a question. Under my floor, Thyra said, in loops, so the heat spreads. Snorri considered this. He had never built a water channel of this kind. Nobody in the district had. But he had built drainage channels, foundation drains, and livestock troughs from fitted stone, and the principle was the same. Water flows downhill. Stone holds water. If you fit the stones tightly enough, with the right mortar, and the channel will not leak. The only difference was temperature. Hot water expanded stone differently than cold water. It deposited minerals as it cooled. It could crack poorly fitted joints through thermal cycling, the constant expansion and contraction of heating and cooling. The mortar will be the problem, Snorri said. Clay mortar will dissolve. Lime mortar will calcite. We need something that can take the heat. What did the Romans use? Snorri looked at her. How do you know about the Romans? My grandmother was Irish. Snorri had heard of Roman waterworks. Every stoneworker in Iceland had heard the stories. The aqueducts, the baths, the heated floors. Most dismissed them as exaggeration. Snorri did not dismiss anything that involved stone and water, because stone and water were the two things he understood. And he knew from experience that both were capable of more than most people imagined. The Romans used a volcanic mortar, he said. Ash and lime. We have both. Iceland had volcanic ash in abundance. The gray-white tephra that blanketed the hillsides after eruptions was virtually identical to the pozzolanic ash the Romans had used to make their waterproof concrete, a material so durable that Roman harbors built with it were still standing after 2,000 years. Snorri had never used it as mortar, but he understood the chemistry intuitively. The ash reacted with lime in the presence of water to form a cement that was harder than clay, more flexible than pure lime, and virtually impervious to both heat and moisture. They began in May. The first task was the channel itself, the 200-yard run from the spring to the Longhouse. Thyra and Arn, her son, 10 years old now, small for his age but determined in the way that children of widows are determined, dug the trench. Snorri cut and fitted the stone. The trench was 18 inches wide and 12 inches deep, cut into the hillside along a carefully measured gradient. Thyra measured the gradient with a technique Snorri taught her. A plank of wood with a cup of water balanced on it, laid across the trench at intervals. If the water sat level in the cup, the grade was right. If it tilted, she adjusted. 1 inch of drop per 20 feet, steep enough for flow, shallow enough for retention. The measurement had to be precise. Too steep, and the water would race through the underfloor channels too fast, dumping its heat into the stream before the floor could absorb it. Too shallow, and the water would pool, build pressure at the bends, and find every imperfection in the mortar joints. She measured every section 3 times, once when the trench was freshly dug, once when the bottom stones were laid, once when the side stones were fitted. She adjusted constantly, adding a 1/2 inch of gravel here, scraping a 1/4 inch of earth there, until the gradient was consistent from spring to Longhouse. 200 yards of precisely graded channel, dropping 10 inches over its entire length. The digging alone took 3 weeks. The trench ran through 3 different soil types as it descended the hillside: volcanic ash at the top, glacial clay in the middle, and a sandy gravel at the bottom where the slope leveled near the farm. Each soil presented different challenges. The ash was loose and crumbled at the edges, requiring Thyra to widen the trench and compact the sides. The clay was dense and exhausting to dig, but held its shape perfectly. The gravel was fast to excavate, but drained water, which meant any leak in the lower section of the channel would vanish into the ground rather than pooling visibly where it could be detected and repaired. Arn worked beside his mother every day. He was too small to dig the full depth, but he could excavate the first 6 inches, the loose topsoil, and clear the debris from the trench bottom so Thyra could see the grade clearly. He could carry stones from Snorri's cutting area to the trench. He could mix mortar, volcanic ash, lime, and water in a wooden trough, stirred with a flat stick until the consistency was right. Snorri was particular about the consistency. "Like thick porridge," he said. "If it pours, it is too wet. If it crumbles, it is too dry. It should hold a thumbprint." The stone lining was the work that took the longest. Snorri selected flat basalt slabs from the lava field behind the farm, dense, dark stone that absorbed heat rather than reflecting it. He cut each slab to width with a chisel and mallet, a process that required extraordinary patience. Basalt was hard, harder than sandstone, harder than limestone, harder than any stone Snorri normally worked with. Each cut required dozens of chisel strikes along a scored line, building a fracture that would eventually, if the scoring was precise, produce a clean break along the desired dimension. A poor score produced a jagged break. A jagged break meant the stone could not be fitted tightly against its neighbor. A loose fit meant a leak. A leak meant heat loss. He cut over 400 stones during the course of the project. 400 basalt slabs, each one scored, struck, broken, examined, fitted, and either accepted or rejected. His rejection rate was roughly 1 in 5. The rejects were too thin, too thick, too irregular, or cracked in the wrong direction. He set them aside for the capstones, where precision mattered less. He fitted the approved stones into the trench in sequence, bottom first, then sides, then capstones on top, creating a closed channel that looked, from the surface, like a low stone wall running down the hillside. Each joint was sealed with the volcanic mortar, pressed into the gap with a flat stick, smoothed with a wet finger, and left to cure for 48 hours before the next section was added. The mortar needed time. If you fitted the next stone before the previous joint had set, the weight could compress the fresh mortar and open the joint below. They worked through June and July. The sun was long, 18 hours of light at midsummer, and they used every hour. Snorri worked from dawn until his hands cramped, then sat in the shade and directed Thyra and Arn while his fingers recovered. Thyra dug ahead of Snorri's stonework, always keeping the trench 20 feet ahead of the lining, so the old man never had to wait for access. Arn mixed mortar, carried stones, and made meals that they ate beside the trench, because walking back to the campsite cost time they did not have. By August, the channel was complete from the spring to the longhouse wall. 200 yards of sealed basalt channel, buried under 6 inches of backfilled earth, invisible from the surface except for the slight ridge of disturbed ground running down the hillside. The water flowed. Thyra opened the intake, a fitted stone gate at the spring end that could be lifted to allow flow or dropped to block it, and watched the hot water enter the channel and disappear under the capstones. She walked downhill alongside the buried channel, pressing her hand against the capstones every 50 feet. Hot at the top, warm at the middle, still warm at the bottom. The stone held the heat. The mortar held the water. Nothing leaked. Nothing escaped. 200 yards and the water arrived at the longhouse wall at 115 degrees, 25 degrees cooler than the spring, but still hot enough to scald a careless hand. Snorri tested the joints by looking for steam. On a cool morning, any leak in the channel would produce a faint wisp of steam where hot water met cold air. He walked the entire length at dawn, examining every foot, looking for the telltale wisps. He found two. Both were minor, hairline cracks in joints that had not fully cured. He repaired them with fresh mortar and tested again 3 days later. Nothing. The channel was watertight. Stay with me, because what Snorri built under her floor is the reason Thyra's hall was the only home in the settlement where the floor itself was warm to the touch in January. The floor system was Snorri's masterwork. He designed it as a series of loops. The hot water entered the longhouse through the north wall, ran south in a stone channel under the floor, turned, ran north again in a parallel channel 6 inches away, turned again, ran south again, and so on. 6 passes across the 30-foot width of the longhouse before exiting through the south wall and discharging into a drainage ditch that carried the cooled water downhill to the stream. The channels were 8 inches wide and 6 inches deep, carved into trenches dug into the floor of the longhouse. Snorri lined them with the same flat basalt and sealed them with the same volcanic mortar. The work was meticulous. Each channel had to be watertight along its entire length. A single leak would allow hot water to seep into the floor substrate, turning the earth beneath the flagstones into mud and eventually undermining the entire floor surface. Snorri tested each section before moving to the next, pouring water from a bucket and watching for any escape through the joints. When he found a seep, and he found several, he opened the joint, reapplied mortar, let it cure, and tested again. The turns were the most challenging part. At each end of the longhouse, the channel had to reverse direction, a 180-degree bend in stone. Snorri could not use curved stones because basalt does not curve. Instead, he cut short, angled segments, 6-inch pieces fitted at slight angles, each one turning the flow a few degrees, building the curve through a series of straight approximations, the way a polygon approximates a circle. The bends added resistance to the flow, too tight, and the water would slow and cool before completing the circuit. Too wide, and the bends would consume floor space needed for the parallel runs. He made the turns at 12 inches of radius, wide enough for the water to flow smoothly, tight enough to fit within the 2-foot transition zone between parallel channels. Each turn required 9 separate stone pieces, each cut to a specific angle, each sealed with mortar that had to withstand the constant thermal cycling of hot water flowing against one face and cool earth pressing against the other. The mortar at the turns was the first place that failure would occur, if failure occurred at all. Snorri knew this. He applied the mortar at the turns twice as thick as elsewhere, and he used a richer mix, 4 parts ash to 1 part lime instead of 3 to 1, for additional strength. Over the channels, he laid flagstones, large flat stones that formed the actual floor surface. The flagstones sat directly on top of the channels, and separated from the hot water by only 2 inches of stone. 2 inches of basalt that conducted heat upward into the room the way a hearthstone conducts heat from the fire below it. Snorri selected the flagstones for their density and uniformity. He wanted even heat distribution, which meant even thickness. A thick flagstone would transmit less heat. A thin one would transmit too much, creating a hot spot that would be uncomfortable to stand on. He settled on 2 inches as the optimal thickness and rejected any stone that varied by more than a quarter inch. The total length of the underfloor channel was roughly 180 feet, 6 passes of 30 feet each. The water entered at the north wall at approximately 115 degrees. It had lost 25 degrees during the 200-yard journey from the spring. By the time it exited at the south wall, it had cooled to roughly 70 degrees, having transferred 45 degrees of heat into the floor above it. 70 degrees was still warm, warmer than the stream it discharged into, warmer than the air outside, warm enough that the discharge point never froze, even in the deepest cold. The floor temperature, measured by Thyra's palm pressed against the flagstones, was approximately 75 degrees at the north end, where the hottest water entered, and 55 degrees at the south end, where the coolest water exited. The average was 65 degrees. 65 degrees. A floor temperature that was warmer than the air temperature in any longhouse in the district. A floor temperature that meant bare feet were comfortable. That meant children could sleep on the floor without furs beneath them. That meant the cold that pooled at floor level in every other longhouse. The cold that froze water in cups and turned breath to ice and killed the elderly and the young simply did not exist. The floor had one property that neither Thyra nor Snorri had anticipated. It dried things. The constant gentle heat radiating up from the flagstones created an environment that was warmer and drier than any longhouse floor in Iceland. Wet boots placed on the floor dried overnight. Damp furs laid across the stones were dry by morning. The wool cloaks that hung on pegs near the wall, perpetually damp in every other longhouse, were crisp and dry within hours of being hung. The drying effect reduced the mold and mildew that plagued Norse longhouses, the black fungus that grew in the damp corners, the musty smell that permeated clothing and bedding, the respiratory irritation that was so constant and so universal that no one identified it as a problem because everyone had it. Thyra moved in on the 1st of September. She and Arn laid their sleeping furs directly on the flagstones, and the stones were warm, and the warmth came from below, from the water, from the earth, from the spring that had been flowing for 10,000 years and would flow for 10,000 more. She did not need to light a fire that night. The floor was warm enough without one. She lit one anyway, for cooking, for light, for the comfort of the flame. But the heat it provided was supplemental, not essential. The floor was doing the work. The earth was doing the work. The spring was doing the work. The first morning, Arn woke before his mother and walked across the floor in bare feet. He walked from one end to the other, feeling the temperature gradient. Warm at the north end, cooler at the south end, but warm everywhere. He had grown up in longhouses where the floor was an enemy, a surface so cold in winter that children wore boots indoors and adults avoided sitting on the ground. This floor was an ally. This floor was giving him something instead of taking it. He stood at the north end, where the flagstone was warmest, and pressed his feet flat against the basalt and felt the heat of the earth coming up through the stone. And he understood, at 10 years old, that his mother had done something that mattered, something beyond their household, something that changed what was possible. Jarl Gunnar Hrafnsson heard about it in October. His steward, a thorough man named Magnus, had ridden past Thera's farm and noticed something unusual. No woodpile, or rather, a woodpile that was conspicuously small for a household heading into winter. Every other farm in the district had been stockpiling wood since August, great walls of split logs, 10 feet high and 40 feet long, enough fuel to burn through 7 months of cold. Thyra had a stack roughly a quarter that size. "She will freeze," Magnus told the Jarl. "Perhaps she plans to burn furniture," Gunnar replied dryly. "Or perhaps she has found another source of heat." Gunnar was not a cruel man, but he was a skeptical one. The idea that a twice-widowed woman on the worst farm in the district had solved the fundamental problem of heating, the problem that consumed more labor, more timber, and more human misery than any other aspect of Norse life, struck him as unlikely. He rode up to investigate. He entered the longhouse and stopped. The air was warm, not hearth warm. The fire was burning low, barely more than coals. This was a different warmth. It came from below, from the floor. He looked down at the flagstones and saw nothing remarkable. Gray basalt, fitted neatly, clean. He pressed his hand against the stone and pulled it back. "The floor is hot," he said. "Warm," Thyra corrected. 70 degrees at this end, 55 at the far end. "How?" She showed him. She walked him outside to the channel entrance at the north wall, where the capstone could be lifted to reveal the flowing water beneath. Steam rose from the opening. The water was clear, faintly tinted with mineral deposits, and it moved with the steady urgency of something that had been flowing for millennia and had no intention of stopping. "From the spring," Gunnar said, 200 yards, stone channel, sealed with volcanic mortar. It flows under the floor in loops and exits at the south wall. And this heats the entire longhouse? The floor is warm in every room. The air above the floor is warm because the floor is warm. I burn 1/4 of the wood that my neighbors burn, and my house is warmer than any of theirs." Gunnar walked back inside. He stood in the center of the room and looked at the floor and thought about the mathematics of what he was seeing. Every household in the district consumed between 20 and 30 cords of wood per winter. Cutting, splitting, hauling, and stacking that wood consumed roughly 400 hours of labor per household per year. Thyra was burning 5 cords. She had saved 300 hours of labor and 15 cords of timber. Multiply that by every household in the district, and the savings were staggering. If Saga of Survival has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Your support helps us bring you more stories of hidden preparation and quiet vindication. "Not every farm has a hot spring," Gunnar said. "No," Thyra agreed, "but there are 11 springs in this district that I know of. 7 are within channel distance of existing farms." Gunnar looked at her. She had counted the springs. She had measured the distances. She had already thought about what he was only beginning to consider, that this was not a single solution for a single farm, but a principle that could be applied wherever the earth offered heat. "You have mapped them," he said. "I have walked the district. I know where the heat is." The deep cold came in January. It was not the worst winter the settlement had seen, but it was bad enough. 3 weeks of temperatures below zero. The fjord froze solid. Snow buried the paths between farms. The woodpiles shrank visibly, day by day, as families burned through their stores, trying to maintain fires that heated their ceilings while their floors stayed cold. But the cold was not the catastrophe. The catastrophe was the fuel. An avalanche on the 12th of January destroyed the timber stand in the valley below the settlement, the stand that every family relied on for emergency fuel when their stockpiles ran low. The slide came down the north slope at dawn, carrying with it 3 acres of birch and spruce. burying the wood under 20 feet of compacted snow and ice. The trees were not gone. They were still there, somewhere under the debris field, but they were unreachable. No amount of digging could access timber buried under a frozen avalanche deposit that would not melt until May. Families had been burning wood at double the normal rate because of the cold. The avalanche removed the safety margin. By the 20th of January, 4 households in the district had exhausted their wood piles entirely. By the 25th, 8 households were rationing. By the end of the month, the crisis was district-wide. Without fuel, a fire-heated longhouse is an ice box. The hearth goes dark. The temperature drops to match the outside air within hours. The walls, which were never insulated, they were timber and daub, designed to keep out rain, not cold, become conduits for the freezing air. The longhouse becomes colder than the outside because the walls trap the cold air inside the way the walls of a well trap cold water. People cannot stay. They crowd into the longhouses of families who still have fuel, packing 30 people into spaces designed for 12, burning through the remaining wood twice as fast. Jarl Gunnar opened his own stores. He distributed wood from his personal reserve, a stockpile maintained by 3 thralls who did nothing but cut, split, and stack timber year-round. It was generous. It was also insufficient. His reserve was large, but not infinite, and with 8 households drawing on it simultaneously, it would last perhaps 2 weeks. 2 weeks of heat in exchange for leaving the Jarl himself without fuel for the remainder of the winter. The mathematics were brutal. There was not enough wood in the district to keep every longhouse heated through February. People began burning furniture. They burned sleeping platforms. They burned storage shelves. They burned the timber partitions that separated living spaces from livestock pens. A farmer named Hakon burned his boat, a 6-oar fishing vessel that represented his livelihood, because the choice was between fishing next summer and surviving this winter. The smoke from the burning boat rose over the settlement like a signal that everyone understood. We are running out. Thyra burned her small woodpile slowly. She did not need to burn it fast. The floor was warm. The walls, warmed by the rising heat from the floor, were warm. The air in the room was warm from floor to ceiling, not stratified the way it was in fire-heated longhouses, boiling at the roof and freezing at the ground. Her wood was for cooking and light. The spring was for warmth, and the spring never ran out, never diminished, never asked for labor or timber or attention. It simply flowed as it had flowed since before the first ship arrived in the fjord, carrying its heat from the depths of the earth to the surface where a woman had finally found a use for it. The Jarl's steward, Magnus, noticed on the 28th of January. He had been riding between farms, assessing fuel reserves, and when he passed Thyra's longhouse, he noticed 2 things. First, the woodpile, still standing, barely touched, while every other woodpile in the district had been reduced to splinters. Second, the steam. Faint wisps of steam rising from the ground along a line running from the hot spring to the longhouse. The channel, the hot water, the floor that needed no fire, he reported to the Jarl. The widow's house is warm, Magnus said. She has burned almost no wood. How? The hot spring. She has channeled it under her floor. The floor is heated by the water. Gunnar had heard rumors of this. He had dismissed them the way he dismissed most things that sounded impossible. But his longhouse was down to 8 days of fuel. His people were burning their possessions. Haakon's boat was ashes, and the widow on the cursed farm was warm. He rode up the next morning. The scene outside was grim. The settlement looked like a place under siege, with stripped longhouses missing their interior timbers, and families huddled around fires so small they barely deserved the name. But inside Thyra's longhouse, the flagstones were warm under his boots, and the air was still, and the fire burned low and easy. A cooking fire, not a survival fire, a fire that was optional rather than essential. "How many people can your floor keep warm?" Gunnar asked. "How many do you need?" That afternoon, Thyra opened her longhouse to 16 people from 3 families who had run out of fuel entirely. They came with their furs and their children, and their gratitude and their disbelief. They descended the 3 steps into the longhouse and felt the warmth rising from the flagstones, and several of them, hardened farmers, men and women who had endured decades of Nordic winters without complaint, stopped in the doorway and stared. The warmth was wrong. Not wrong in a bad way. Wrong in the way that miracles are wrong. They violate what you thought you knew about how the world works. A child named Katla, 4 years old, the daughter of the family that had been without fuel the longest, walked to the center of the room and sat down on the bare flagstones. She sat down the way children sit, simply, without thought, without testing the surface first. She sat, and the stone was warm beneath her, and she spread her hands flat on the floor and looked up at her mother with an expression that her mother would remember for the rest of her life. Not happiness, not relief, surprise. The child had never felt a warm floor. She did not know that floors could be warm. She had been alive for 4 winters, and in all 4 of those winters, the floor had been the coldest part of every room she had entered. The floor was where the cold lived. That was what she knew. And now the floor was warm, and everything she knew was wrong, and she was 4 years old and sitting on heated stone in the middle of January, and her face said all of it without a single word. They lay on the flagstones and felt the warmth rising from below, and they did not understand it, but they accepted it the way people accept miracles. Without question, without analysis, with only the profound relief of warmth after cold. The longhouse was crowded, 36 feet of floor space for 20 people, including Thyra and Arn. But it was warm. Every square foot of it was warm. The hot water flowed beneath the stones without ceasing, carrying its heat from the depths of the earth to the surface, asking nothing, providing everything. Thyra did not ration the heat. You cannot ration a spring. You cannot reduce the flow of something that has been flowing for 10,000 years. The heat was there. It was free. It was permanent. It required no wood, no labor, and no maintenance beyond the annual flushing of mineral deposits from the channels. It simply existed, the way the earth exists, the way the fjord exists, offering itself to whoever was paying attention. For 3 weeks, Thyra's longhouse was a refuge. Families rotated through as fuel supplies waxed and waned across the district. Some stayed for days. Some stayed for a week. The children adapted fastest. They discovered that the north end of the floor, where the hottest water entered, was warm enough to sit on bare stone without a fur, and they gathered there in clusters, playing games and telling stories, while the wind howled outside and the temperature dropped and the rest of the settlement struggled. The adults adapted slower. Some of them sat on the warm floor and wept, not from sadness, but from the sudden release of tension that came from being warm after weeks of cold. The body remembers cold even when the mind tries to forget it, and when the body finally feels warmth again, it responds with an emotion that has no name, but that looks, from the outside, very much like grief. If Saga of Survival has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Your support helps us bring you more stories of hidden preparation and quiet vindication. The crisis broke in mid-February when a Chinook wind melted enough snow to access the buried timber stand. Men cut wood from the exposed edges of the avalanche debris and hauled it back to the settlement on sledges. The fires returned. The panic receded. The immediate danger passed. But the memory did not pass. The memory of the warm floor and the flowing water and the woman who had enough heat for everyone while the rest of the district burned their boats. That memory sat in the minds of every person who had sheltered in Thyra's longhouse, and it changed what they believed was possible. By spring, 3 of her neighbors had come to ask about the channel. 2 of them had hot springs on or near their own property, springs they had ignored or avoided or fenced off as hazards for years. Thyra walked their land with them, measuring gradients, testing stone quality, calculating channel distances. She taught them the mortar recipe: 3 parts volcanic ash, 1 part lime, mixed with water to a thick paste. She showed them the loop pattern for the underfloor channels. She explained the gradient, 1 inch per 20 feet, and the intake gate and the discharge point, and the importance of capstones and the risk of mineral buildup that would need to be flushed every spring by opening both ends and running full-pressure water through the system. The earth is offering you heat, she told each one. It has been offering it your entire life. You have been fencing it off and warning your children away from it and calling this land cursed. The land is not cursed. The land is generous. You just have to carry what it gives you to where you need it. Snorri helped build 2 of the 3 new systems before his hands gave out entirely. The old stoneworker's fingers, scarred from decades of chisel work, had lost the fine motor control needed to fit basalt slabs into tight joints. He could still cut stone, the heavy work, the scoring and striking, but the fitting, the finishing, the mortar application that required a steady hand and a precise eye, these had passed beyond his ability. He trained his apprentice, a young man named Bjorn, who had learned the volcanic mortar technique and improved it, adding crushed basalt to the mix, which made it set faster and resist cracking through thermal cycles. I have cut stone my entire life, Snorri told Thyra on the day he set down his chisel for the last time. I have built walls and foundations and hearths and tombs, but the channel is the best thing I ever built. Because the channel does not sit there, the channel works. It carries. It moves. It brings the heat from where it is to where it is needed. Everything else I built just sits. By the 3rd winter, 4 longhouses in the Eyjafjord district were heated by hot spring water running under their floors. By the 5th winter, 7. By the 10th, the technique had spread to neighboring districts wherever the geology provided hot water, and the phrase, Thyra's floor, had entered the vocabulary of the region the way useful phrases do, quietly, without ceremony, simply because it described something that worked and that people wanted. Gunnar, the Jarl, commissioned a channel for his own longhouse in the 3rd year. The nearest hot spring to his farm was 340 yards, farther than anyone had yet attempted. Thyra advised against it. The heat loss over that distance would be significant. The channel would need to be buried deeper, insulated with packed earth. and the underfloor loops would need to be wider to slow the water and extract more heat per pass. Arn, 12 now and already showing the careful precision that would define his life, solved the problem. He suggested a double-walled channel for the longest sections, an inner channel for the hot water, an outer channel filled with dry volcanic ash as insulation, the air gap between them trapping heat the way a double-walled cup traps the warmth of the liquid inside. Snorri, watching from the sideline with his ruined hands, nodded. The boy understood stone the way some people understand music, not through study, but through resonance. The Jarl's system worked, 340 yards. The water arrived at 85 degrees, cooler than Thyra's system, but still warm enough to heat the floor to 55 degrees throughout the longhouse. Gunnar burned half the wood he had burned before. His children slept on warm stone. His wife stopped complaining about the drafts. And the phrase, "the cursed farm," quietly disappeared from the district's vocabulary, replaced by nothing because there was nothing to replace it with. The farm was not cursed. The farm was the source. Thyra married again, a widower named Einar who was drawn less by the woman than by the warm floor, though he grew to love both. They had 2 children who grew up never knowing what it meant to sleep on a cold floor, who grew up thinking that warmth from below was normal, who grew up placing their bare feet on flagstones in January and feeling the heat of the earth rising through 2 inches of stone from water that had been hot since the world began. Arn became a stoneworker under Bjorn, Snorri's apprentice. He built hot water floor systems for 20 years, refining the design, extending the range, reducing the heat loss. He developed the double-walled channel into a standard technique. He built the longest system in Iceland, a 600-yard channel from a powerful spring to a chieftain's hall that heated 3 separate buildings from a single source. Each system he built carried a piece of the knowledge that old Snorri had given him, and Snorri had received from his years of watching stone and water interact. And Thyra had received from an Irish grandmother who remembered stories about Romans. The Thyra lived to be 61. She died in her longhouse on her warm floor in the middle of January. The water was still flowing beneath the stones when they carried her out. It is still flowing now. The spring does not know she is gone. The spring does not care. The spring does what the earth does. It offers its heat to anyone wise enough to carry it home. Thank you for watching this story about Thyra Ketilsdottir and the stone channel she built from the hot spring to her hall. If it reminded you that the earth is always offering, and the question is whether we are wise enough to accept, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Saga of Survival for more stories of those who built when others laughed and survived when others couldn't. What is the shelter that everyone thinks you don't have? And where have you buried your preparation?